Well, I better get to putting this film advanced stuff in the camera. I've brushed this out, but you wouldn't know it. I'll have another go. Right, as you were. Here's the take-up spool. I'll put the spacer in the bottom, or the bush. That goes in there. Close the back up. Here's the take-up shaft, the advanced shaft. I need to lubricate that. Right, let's get onto this. Working that in to make sure that's fully covered. I'll put some on the spring itself just so the coils of the spring slide neatly over each other, don't tend to bind up or anything. That looks fine. Let's pop this in place. Now by convention the slot goes towards the end of the camera. It doesn't really make an awful lot of difference. And there are 3 small screws hold this in place. I'll just make sure that the take-up spool is seated on there, that's fine. Sometimes the spring might catch on that bush in the take-up spool and not seat correctly. Alright, with the 3 screws now fitted, I can tighten the screws up. That's that little bit done. Now the catch for the rewind button needs to go in. That's here, so I'm just going to run some molybdenum paste around the end of that. That's the rounded end. Put that into position. Now the original spring was undernourished and flattened out. I've got one from another camera here that I can use. Actually that lever, I think that's bent. Looking at that, of course nothing would surprise me much with this camera. That's not sitting flat, that's bent up. Now I know from experience, because there's almost no metal left here either side of the hole, straightening that out it's just likely to fail. So I'd say I'd better find another one of those. Well, this one looks a little bit better, so that's what I'll use. Now just compare those 2 components. It's vaguely possible that this one that I've just chosen is a heavier cross section. We'll find out shortly, because if it tightens up when I do the screw up, I'll know that it's not going to do the job for me, and I'll either have to find a screw with a longer shoulder, which wouldn't be hard, this is an early camera. It's possible that, I know parts of the design changed during production. I wasn't aware that there was a change with this component, but it's a possibility. No, that moves smoothly. That'll be fine. I'll just get that spring hooked across. Easier said than done when you've got things well lubricated. That's better. Okay, so that's in place. That was unexpected. I wasn't expecting to have to replace that. Right, so our film sprocket. Well, it's still a little bit discoloured, but I've cleaned it. I don't see any point in polishing that to make it look exceptionally pretty. It won't affect the way it functions. So, our film sprocket goes in slot side to the top. And the shaft needs to be lubricated. I'll use some synthetic grease, some towards the top where it's going to run through the casting, a touch on the teeth of the gears at the top, some towards the bottom where it's going to run through the casting. Feed that down through the sprocket, and holding this with my finger at the top, I can pull back this catch and the shaft will come right through. Now the screw that drives the sprocket from the sprocket shaft needs to be fitted at this point. See if I can get that in place. Yep, that's going in. Sometimes that'll only lead in smoothly from one side of the shaft but not the other. That worked fine. The rewind button next. Now the rewind button is here. Its return spring needs to be lubricated. A touch of synthetic grease will do that nicely. And we have the washer, which cleaned up pretty well. That looked pretty ugly to start with. It's okay now. That screws into the bottom of the sprocket shaft. Make sure it clicks down and releases. That looks good, and I can tighten that up. Now the pliers I'm using to tighten that up were just a cheap pair of needle nose pliers. I cut the end off them with might be with a cutting disc on a grinder perhaps with a Dremel, probably a cutting disc. Set them in the vise on end, whacked a centre punch in the centre, and then drilled down a hole between the jaws, and the right size for that button. The same approach works for anything that you've got to undo of that nature. Any screw that fancy screw that you haven't got any other way of getting onto. And of course you want a nice cheap pair of pliers with soft steel so that you can modify it easily. Right, what's next? Oh, we've got to close up the base of the camera. So what do we got here? This piece, this little insert here, that's just to stop the screw on your tripod from being wound through the base of the camera. The tripod socket cleaned up reasonably well. It's held in place with 3 screws. These screws are a little bit corroded on the ends, which is hardly surprising given the level of corrosion with this camera. They're normally somewhat discoloured from the adhesive if nothing else. Let's get those down tight. That looks good. And the little shield that goes around the rewind button. Now the design of this shield changed over time as well. This one is dead flat. Later ones had 2 ears on them, so you couldn't easily accidentally push the rewind button in when you're handling the camera. This one lacks that. It also has countersunk holes here for these smaller screws. Later cameras had counterboard holes in there, and they took a brass screw. Do those up. That's the base of the camera dealt with. I could put the leather on that now or leave it till later. I'll probably leave it till later because it's not going to interfere with anything else I'm doing. I think I'll do the film rewind at the moment. Let's do that first. So some synthetic grease here. Now I think from memory there are 2 holes here. I'm not sure which one we're supposed to be using. This one probably. That's only something you see on the earliest examples, and almost certainly it was just a manufacturing defect or hiccup in the process. See if we can get this in here. That one there I think I should be using. This is a bit stiff. It should have some resistance, you don't want it slopping about. Put that in place. Now there's a special screw that goes in there, which I think technically you'd probably call a dog point screw. That doesn't lift up very far, so I would say that is not where I want it to be. I have to move it around to the other hole. Let's try this one. This arrangement, this sliding section on the rewind, is to allow you to pull up the rewind button, the rewind knob, to wind the film so that you've got better clearance around the top of the camera. You've got room to get your fingers. That moves nicely. And in the down position, it's down tight against the head here, and it'll raise that much, which is about 1/4 inch, about 6 millimeters I'd say it, I guess. Here's the bush. I'll just lubricate that with a bit of synthetic grease. It'll probably work well. Check that that moves smoothly. It shouldn't be loose and rattly, but it should just move fairly smoothly. And this is held in place with 2 screws. Same size as those that were used to hold the tripod socket at the base of the camera, except these ones are likely to be uncorroded and free from traces of adhesive. And you might as well have the pretty screws at the top of the camera, where somebody is much more likely to see them if they come in at a later date to do any repair work. Okay, that side looks good. Now the film advance components we still have to deal with. So this is the clutch assembly. And the clutch assembly is 3 pieces. The spring here drives one component from the other. There's a little tab on the spring that drops into a notch in the top of the centerpiece. So we have to compress this spring and then get this over the top without displacing it from that notch. So it's always a little bit entertaining, and I need a special pair of pliers to help me do that. Right, I'll lubricate this clutch. And the spring. This looks a little bit misshapen. We'll see how that goes. What I normally do is lay it in place, hang it in place like that with the tab in position. Now I've got a pair of cheap crimp lug pliers here, which I can lay in place, then rotate this between my fingers to pull the spring into line, put the outer in place, push it down, and that's the clutch assembled. And it'll be much smoother in one direction than the other. I think that that's probably a bit stiffer than it should be, so I'm going to find another spring. I said I didn't like the look of that spring. Let's find another one. Right, well I've found another spring. Let's give this one a go. It's awkward getting your crimp lug pliers correctly positioned. You have to lower the top jaw over the spring so you don't disturb it, and rotate that to pull the spring into line. Put that down in place. Now that's much better. That's what was wanted. I'm starting to assemble a few dud parts from this camera. I'll put a little bit of synthetic grease through the centre there. It should drop down into place. Why is that so tight in there? Is that a funny shape? Fish that out and have a look at it. There's something odd about that. It's a funny shape, I think. See if we can have it out and have a look at it. That lip around the bottom there, is that larger than on later cameras? I think it is. That is a different shape. Yeah, well, okay, well it certainly works. Interesting. Okay, we'll pop that back into place. Yeah, I think that's broader at the base than the other cameras. Right, that part's dealt with. This part is the bush that holds all that in place, and it has two little gear sets or pinions mated onto shafts. I'm just forcing a bit of grease in there with hydraulic pressure by putting a great glob of it where I want it, then pressing it in with my thumb. Put that in there. Now if I rotate that take-up spool, that should engage the top of the clutch. That looks good. And I've got 3 screws to hold this in place. Now these screws are the same size as the screws that we used to hold the tripod socket in and the rewind post. Once all 3 screws are in position, check by rolling the sprocket that the wheel moves there, and by rolling the take-up spool that the wheel moves there, and tighten these 3 screws up and recheck just to make sure nothing has gone wrong. That looks good. And start assembling the rest of the film advance. Right, we'll start with this gear. This couples the sprocket and the take-up spool together through the clutch. I'm just rolling that sprocket with my thumb. I was checking the smoothness of that action. It does appear to be okay. Probably put a light wipe of grease on there. Put that little drive dog in place. Put that spring in place. Now we've got the pawl that stops the film advance from backing up. That goes on here. And this post has to go into place. It has the spring on it, so it has to pass through the pawl, through the spacer, and screw into the top of the camera body. So it's only medium difficult. There we go, that's happening. That up and hook the spring correctly in place so that the short end of the spring hooks in behind this pawl at this point. And if I zoom in, you'll see that ratchet action. I'll roll that sprocket wheel. You can see that ratchet action happening there. Okay, so far so good. Zoom out a bit. This piece, just applying a bit of synthetic grease there, just a light touch. Now this fits on here. From experience, I know that I'm going to have approximately correct tension on the film advance to return the lever to the rest position. If it starts in about that position, so that cutout, that narrower cutout is pointing over this way, and that'll probably work quite well. If I rotate this clockwise, engage it with that drive dog that we had there, that's sitting nice and flush. I'll just rotate this so I can see what I'm doing better. Yeah, in this case I've got a shiny silver coloured spring. That is usually black in most later cameras. That drops down that hole because it's got to push up this little lever here. That lever serves to control the action of the film advance, so that as you move forward, the lever will only move forward. As when it gets to the end of the stroke, the lever will only return to the rest position. It can't be inched backwards and forwards. This bracket has a gear on the top. I'm just going to force some grease into that. All of these parts have been through the ultrasonic cleaner, so they're somewhat devoid of any lubrication. And that goes on here. I'll zoom you out a bit, you see nothing. Make sure that this piece here is underneath the tab on that film advance. There are two plain screws, one at the end here, one down in here, which is awkward to get at. If you're having trouble seeing, I'm having trouble seeing too. Oh, that beautifully positioned, but it was upside down. Okay, let's get that screw started. I've only done those screws up lightly at this stage. The third screw goes here. It's a shoulder screw, and it goes through this spring. Now that spring is an odd shape. Don't be tempted to straighten it up because you think things should look squarer than that. They probably shouldn't be. It's also an easy spring to lose when you're working on the camera. And I can tell you that it's not easy to make a replacement if you lose it. Right, so if I depress this lever, I can swing that spring back behind it. Now that's sitting in the rest position. I can tighten those three screws up. I think I already have. Yep. The gear goes on top here. Engage that. And I'm ready to install the rack, or I would be if I had my film advance lever cleaned up, but I haven't done it yet. Better get to that. Yeah, this is a pretty sad and sorry looking advance lever. Looks like hungry rats have gnawed their way into the aluminium there. It must have been very, very corroded. I've got to take this all apart because this catch doesn't move freely. It's hardly moving at all. It'll lift off this leatherette. This patch is leatherette here by the looks of it. which is very odd because everything else on that camera is leather. Take that off. There are two small screws. These are small, and like all small things are easily lost. That one gave me trouble because the slot was filled with adhesive. Right, let's pry that cover off gently. There is the return spring, and it's somewhat bent. You probably can't even see that. Here is the lever, and this is somewhat bent too. I'm going to have to try and straighten that up. What it means is that someone has forced it at some stage. They've reached the end of the film, or the counter has reached number 1 and locked, and they have gone crazy and started pushing and pulling and twisting instead of reading the instructions or remembering what to do. Well, regardless of that, this thing is clogged up with filth. There's all sorts of rubbish in here, corrosion, sand and so forth. So I'm going to go and clean this in the ultrasonic cleaner in the hope that it'll get rid of some of this rubbish and give me a clean place to start. The rubber here, the little pad, that's gone, that's perished. So that'll need to be replaced. Right, I'll clean this up and come back because I can see it's time to stop now anyway. The camera is grizzling that its battery's nearly flat.